When do we call to order the Wednesday, June 16th, 2010 meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Creeks and Water Quality Advisory Committee? And let's ask the clerk to call the roll to make sure we have a quorum.
Chair Moldaver.
Here.
Mr. Bullock.
Here.
Ms. Weber. Here. Mr. Wilson. And Ms. Lomas, Ms. Self, and Mr. Jordan are not here yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Quorum being present, why don't we move to item number 3, which is the approval of the minutes from the May 12th, 2010 meeting. Have you all had a chance to review the draft minutes from May 12th? Are there any corrections or amendments? Is there a motion to accept the draft minutes as submitted?
Motion to accept the minutes.
Is there a second? All right, it's moved by Mr. Wilson and seconded by Mr. Bullock. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstentions? The minutes are unanimously adopted. Thank you. That brings us to item number 4, adjustments to the agenda. Mr. Benson, are there any adjustments proposed for the agenda?
No.
Okay. And any other questions about the status of the agenda? Okay, that brings us to item number 5, public comment. Under the Ralph M. Brown Act, any member of the public who is present today can speak on any relevant topic for up to 2 minutes if it's not already listed on the agenda. Is anyone here to share their thoughts about creeks and watersheds? And that includes in their civilian after 5 role, Ms. Murray and Ms. Smolanka. Nope. Okay. No public comment, which brings us on to item number 6, committee member and staff communications. Anything to share? Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Chair. I would like to cordially and informally invite Creeks Division staff and advisory committee members to look at a typical situation in Midtown Santa Barbara along the creeks at my office right by State and Hitchcock with a branch of San Roque or Arroyo Burro tributary creek right outside my office. And I just think it would be a great opportunity for all folks herein to, have a little bit of a nice snapshot look of urban creeks with smothered with ivy and other weeds, and a giant gallery of large trees, and the interesting opportunities that present themselves probably 1,000 times over throughout the city. And so perhaps that could make it onto a field trip or a future agenda or something. So I put it out there now. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Anything else? I've got 2 that are not related, although several hundred people were aware of it. The rest of the community may not have been able to fully appreciate the fantastic job that committee member Weber did a week ago Sunday at a gala charity fundraising event at the Stowe House in Goleta, where one of the top law firms in California that focuses on the environment and resource management had their annual event, and Ms. Weber was part of the event team and did phenomenally well. So I want to say good job. And on a similar note, I just want to brag a little that another local nonprofit, which is having its annual meeting this Saturday at City College, has hired the valedictorian from the Bren School, Leanne French, to be their new executive director. And I think Saturday they're going to be honoring, Mark Chatillo, Bob Field, Don Olson, Marty Bloom, Tom Murphy, and Donna Jordan and the No on J committee for career and individual service to the natural resources of the Central Coast. So anyone who's interested, feel free to call in. But if you see Leanne French walking around downtown, give her a warm Santa Barbara welcome, because she's fantastic. And those commercials aside, that brings us to item number 7, the 2 key business items. Mr. Benson, do you want to introduce Ms. Smolenka?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our first item tonight and our first presentation is going to be an annual report on the city's stormwater management program. As you recall, this is the stormwater management program is actually the city's stormwater discharge permit under the Federal Clean Water Act. And it was approved by the Regional Water Quality Control Board and went into effect on January 1st, 2009. So we had our first annual report to submit on April 1st. And tonight we have Autumn Malanka, who is Water Resources Specialist with the city's Creeks Division. She's going to give the committee a report that essentially mirrors the report that we submitted to the Regional Water Board.
Thank you. Good evening, committee members. It's good to be back. It's been almost exactly 1 year since I was up here last July giving a brief status report on the stormwater management program at that point. And I'm back now because we've officially completed year 1 of our stormwater management program implementation, and we submitted our annual report in April. Oh, I'm clicking on it. Got it. Thanks. Okay, we'll wait. Isn't it usually just a click of the button to go next? Okay. Okay. So, as you all have heard this from me several times in my stormwater management program presentations, which we refer to as the SWIMP, it's a coordinated effort. It's a citywide requirement that's produced and implemented by all city staff. Creeks Division, mainly being myself, provides overall coordination. It is a requirement. That's something that we continue to stress. This isn't just a city policy or goal. And by requirement, I should clarify in that it is an actual permit. It's referred to as the general permit by the state. And it's something that we, as a municipal body, has to have in order to discharge stormwater to surface water. So it's almost better referred to as a permit. The SWIMP has evolved a lot over the past 5 or 6 years. There's been a lot of work on it, and it was finally approved in January of 2009. And that kicked off formal implementation of the stormwater management program and year 1. We had informally been implementing the program for about 3 years prior to that. So the intent of our permit is to reduce the discharge of pollutants, protect and improve water quality. That's really it in a nutshell. There's a real specific framework and methods that all stormwater management programs across the state follow, and that is to address 6 minimum control measures. They're loosely referred to as MCMs. I like to just call them control measures. Within each of these control measure sections of the SWIMP, there's best management practices identified, and those are required to be implemented, and then the best management practices have measurable goals attached to each of them. So it's a tier setup. They're all laid out in tables. It's really easily referenced. Some people are a little bit intimidated by the SWIMP document, but if you just turn to the tables, everything that's required is really summarized well. The timeline of any stormwater management program is 5 years. So that started for us in January 2009 when it was approved. And as I mentioned, our first annual report was submitted to the Regional Water Quality Control Board April 1st, 2010. It was actually submitted a few days early. Here are the minimum control measures. I won't belabor this slide because we've all heard these. Public education and outreach, public involvement and participation. There's just a little bit of difference between those two. Illicit discharge detection and elimination, which also includes a necessity of the public participating in that through our enforcement requirements. Construction site stormwater runoff control, post-construction stormwater management, which I'll explain a little bit later what that is, and pollution prevention, which is good housekeeping basically for city staff, municipal operations. So the best management practices in the SWMP, as I mentioned, they fall under the 6 minimum control measures, and they have many measurable goals. In fact, BMPs can have several measurable goals. So that comes to a grand total of about 167 total BMPs in the city's SWMP, and that is what I'm coordinating to make sure that they're all being met by other city departments as well as our own. Those also include the airport and waterfront BMPs. 41 of those are specifically required by the Creeks Division, or the Creeks Division are required to implement 41 of those. 15 we coordinate with other city departments to make sure that they're implemented, and then the other 111 of those are waterfront, airport, parks and recreation, public works, community development planning department, and or fire. So it's a big effort is really the point here. Year one, I wanted to just kind of show the annual report so everyone knows what we're talking about. There's a lot that the city does to comply with stormwater requirements. A lot of this document is attachments. It's not all text that I had the pleasure of writing, but it is a lot of proof showing what the city does to achieve these BMPs and measurable goals. So we coordinate and comply with quarterly reporting is the way that I conduct compiling this annual report. I get quarterly reports from 13 other city departments and divisions. The managers and supervisors of those divisions, they send me reports saying, yes, we've complied with the BMPs every 3 months. The report focuses on how the city has implemented the goals. It includes attachments, as I've mentioned. The supporting documentation and attachments that I'm talking about are like sign-in sheets for trainings that we're required to do, or purchase orders showing that we're actually using contractors who do capture and treat their water, those kind of things. The list can go on and on. A lot of it is the great work that Liz Smith does here for the outreach and education and public involvement efforts, showing all the different media materials she's come up with and those sorts of things. The last element of the annual report is called the Program Effectiveness Assessment, and that's actually something that was developed by the California Water Quality Association, Stormwater Quality Association, or CASCA, and the Water Board subsequently adopted that process. And what it is basically an assessment of how effective our stormwater program is. It uses a rating system, so it applies actual categorical numbers to each BMP and says, yes, we're reaching this level of achievement in stormwater protection. It helps us identify modifications that may be needed. So starting with public education and outreach and what we were able to achieve in year one. Public education and outreach, this minimum control measure really educates the public about what runoff is, what are the impacts, and what are methods that we can implement to reduce stormwater pollution or just practice day to day as residents. This is really a Creeks Division focus in the stormwater management program. The example that I wanted to bring up tonight is business outreach. In 2009, we started the outreach with our businesses to include mobile washers, which is a new sector, business sector that we hadn't targeted yet. And this actually means we're ahead of schedule because in our permit or stormwater management program, we don't have to outreach to mobile washers until year 3, technically, but we've already started, so we're on track to even include more business sectors than we committed to in our SWMP. A total of 21 businesses were inspected and certified as a clean water business in year 1. How many businesses total? Lots. As far as mobile washers, I think there's about 60, 65.
You mean the program?
Yeah, with business licenses. Public involvement. This is more fostering active community participation in learning and actually physically supporting protecting water quality. This is another Creeks Division focus, and this Creeks Advisory Committee is a perfect example of one. This is a requirement by our program to have these meetings in order to get the word out to residents and businesses what kind of efforts we're doing to comply with water quality requirements. Intergovernmental meetings are another one that we're required to do. I participate in those quarterly, and that's meeting with Santa Maria and Carpinteria and the county, and we all get together and talk about what we're doing to comply with our permits, as well as outreach efforts that are working or not working. It's a good brainstorming opportunity. Stakeholder meetings, often tabled by the county. That's another thing that we participate in. The annual Community Water Quality Forum that happens every year that the Creeks Division puts on, and volunteer projects like stormwater quality monitoring. The minimum control measure number 3, illicit discharge detection and elimination, works to identify and eliminate sources of illicit discharges and illegal dumping. Enforcement is a big part of this control measure, and that's something that is managed by the Creeks Division as far as enforcing specifically. It's the municipal code is 16.15. It basically says that water pollution is prohibited, and we have an enforcement line, which I've talked to you guys about in the past. We received 181 calls last year, so it was a success. And I think the truth is that we receive more calls almost every year. So the word is getting out, people are becoming more aware, and things are getting reported to the Creeks Division, which is good news. Another exciting thing, in my opinion, that we did was we created these response cards. They were produced and they're now being implemented as part of the enforcement program. And basically, if we get contact information from the person who calls the discharge into the Creeks Division, we can send them this card and say, tell us how we're doing. You know, what was it that you saw? How would you rate our performance on, you know, how quickly we showed up? And did you feel that your report was well tended to? Were things resolved? So I'll pass these down. We also conducted a stormwater ordinance audit in year 1, and that was basically to assess the need for a stormwater ordinance, which is actually a requirement in our permit to happen in year 3. We're starting with drafting that ordinance this year. In year 2, there'll be some public outreach efforts later on this year. And the audit was to assess where there's inconsistencies with the stormwater requirements that the state has and that are reflected in our permit. There's inconsistencies among all the different departments and divisions that we need to address. So those inconsistencies at least have been identified. That was a big effort in year 1. Construction site stormwater runoff control is implemented and enforced under the authority of our city's building division. So that's really their focus. And those BMPs in that minimum control measure really focus on the erosion and sediment control policy, how well it's doing, you know, can it be updated? So there's an assessment of that that's required under our permit. Pre-construction site plan review is required, and the building division has to actually track how many projects they review for erosion control measures and which ones were in compliance and which ones were not throughout the year. So that's another attachment in the annual report displaying, you know, how well our local contractors are doing as far as maintaining their erosion and runoff control measures. The building division also inspects construction sites to track these BMPs of erosion controls, and that's a long report. Proposed modification actually came out of this year 1 report. The original BMP for buildings said that they were to reduce problems on construction site by 10% annually. And the building division was having a hard time coming up with how to assess that, how to track that. And so they came up with a proposed new BMP, which is more of an outreach effort to contractors. It should work. We'll see how it goes. That'll be reported in year 2. Post-construction stormwater management, that's basically a fancy word that means we're implementing design requirements to address stormwater runoff from new and or redevelopment. So this is where the Community Development Department comes in to having to implement BMPs for the permit. They have to implement the stormwater management program requirements, which have to do with making sure that peak flows are not increased from proposed projects, that runoff volume from projects are not increased, that they're maintained or ideally decreased, and that water quality is addressed in each and every project that goes to Planning Commission. We're getting better at identifying the requirements and making sure that projects are complying. 30 projects implemented post-construction BMPs last year, and what that number means are those are the projects that were actually completed, got their building permit and had stormwater BMPs implemented. Now, the very last minimum control measure is called good housekeeping, basically. It ensures that city operations and all of the city staff protect stormwater quality. I do trainings annually that with all city staff that explains how we conduct our business day to day to protect stormwater quality, know where storm drains are, and lead by example. Show other residents and business owners how to do business without impacting surface water quality. One of the BMPs in our permit are that facility inspections have to be conducted annually now by creeks. And creek staff located just a few deficiencies. Some of them were in the city annex yard, and a couple of them were in our parks yard. The good news is that this is identifying things that needed to be changed, and now they're being rectified. So even though this is some extra effort for city staff, it's a good thing because we're finding where improvements need to be made, which is the whole idea of the permit and the program. Street sweeping, actually, the final calculations for year one was 2,300 tons of debris collected from our streets. So that means that amount of trash and leaves and dirt that did not get into the creeks and the storm drains, which is good news. And catch basin filters are being replaced with debris screens. That was another big decision made in year one. Turns out cleaning catch basin filters, the effort, it far outweighs the advantages, and we've come up with we've started implementing a new debris screen design, which we received a grant for that you've all heard about, that are now replacing these catch basin filters. So that was reported in year one report. So the report closes with the program effectiveness assessment, and as I mentioned in the beginning, this assessment basically evaluates our BMPs. It identifies what modifications are needed and ultimately determines if the overall SWMP is truly working effectively as it should. Year one, the display was that the city SWMP is on track for effectiveness. There were a few modifications. They were pretty minor. One BMP dropped out entirely, and that was cleaning the catch basin filter inserts because we now have the screens. Hopefully the number of the amount of tons of debris catched will increase next year because of that. We'll see. So as far as effectiveness of the SWMP, I feel pretty confident on how we're doing so far. So it being June already, can't believe it, we're 6 months into year two of formal SWMP implementation, and the annual report is due again in April of 2011. My coordination effort goes on. It's a daily task. City staff is improving, as I mentioned, on their annual tracking, because tracking is a new requirement on their end that they actually need to track what they're doing these days so we can report to the water board. And overall, we're on track to meeting the SWMP requirements. We'll be sure to let you know how it goes. Any questions?
Thank you, Autumn.
Come up with something good.
Very good report. It's great to see such progress so quickly. It probably means the other departments, in spite of the tough times, are all pitching in and trying to do their best. Does anyone have a specific question about any part of Autumn's oral presentation or the written report that was in the packet? Daniel?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Autumn.
Sure.
Great work.
Thank you.
This response card is awesome.
Good. I think so too.
Have you been getting any back?
Yes. We just started getting a few back. I think Jim's received a handful of them. And so far they've been good responses.
Nice. Do you guys put a little stamp on here to make it that much easier?
Yep.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Kudos. I'm wondering how other city departments are receiving Creeks Division guidance and trainings, how they're receiving and how they're responding, and maybe where the difficulties still lie in, herding 13 different divisions of cats and chickens and the like, and where the next sort of set of internal challenges to overcome are.
Yeah. It's a challenge. That's the easy answer. It's definitely a challenge. Coordinating that amount of people, no matter what, is going to be a challenge. And the training and level of getting everyone on the same page of what the requirements are and how we can implement them is a lot of work. And everyone is working to get there. I think I've actually been pretty impressed with at least the willingness from community development in particular to help learn the stormwater requirements, because in the past it's something that one division focuses on and that division has their requirements that they have to implement. But now this is something that is a citywide thing and we all need to know them. So it's kind of a new concept, and it has been met with a lot of people question, wait a second, why do we need to learn this? This is new and this isn't what my normal job entails. So we, I think, passed that major hurdle in year one. We did a big training outreach effort with city staff. There were 2 big main trainings and then a bunch of little kind of private session trainings behind the scenes that occurred. And after those trainings, I did notice a decrease in calls from project applicants saying, okay, what are these stormwater requirements and how do I implement them into my project? And that means it's because planning staff was actually answering questions for them and guiding them correctly to the guidance manual, which we produced to help project applicants. So that's the long answer. The short answer, it's going well. I think that it just needs to be recognized that it's an ongoing effort of getting city staff to understand the details of the stormwater requirements as well as all of the BMPs in the permit. It's 2 things, that what projects have to comply with as far as stormwater requirements as well as what city staff has to comply with as far as their BMPs in the permit. So it's a lot. And we're learning it slow but sure.
Thanks.
Paul, any questions? Given this interest from community development, are some of the recommendations from the stormwater management plan being interpolated into the subtext of the Plan Santa Barbara update? And that will give us a chance to remind anyone who's watching the meeting at home that next week there's going to be a very important community workshop with the staff and the decision makers about the direction of Plan Santa Barbara. But is this stuff in one of the footnotes or in one of the sections?
Good question. I'll check. You mean? I think. You're asking in plans. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a proposed policy in the Plan Santa Barbara document that incorporates by reference the SWIMP standards.
Oh, right. Okay.
And Cameron, if someone is watching at home and wants to find out more about Plan Santa Barbara at the workshop next week, do you happen to remember? I think it's in this room, isn't it? And is it next Wednesday? Is it 22nd and 23rd?
I can't remember the location. If anyone's interested in looking that up, it's on the Plan Santa Barbara website, which is uplansb.org, and that's YOUPLANSB.org.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's in the back of my mind that it's in this room on the 22nd and 23rd. Yeah.
He's good.
Oh, Mr. Wilson?
Thanks. I was a little foggy as to the 5-year timeline. really what that meant. So, if I understand it correctly, a certain set of goals are to be achieved within 5 years, and that they're measured goals. So, municipalities are not burdened with a ton of to-do actions immediately, and so they're given time to implement it. Am I understanding that correctly?
More or less.
And then at the end of 5 years, the regional board says, yes, you've succeeded, or no, you haven't, and then they come down with a hammer, or what happens?
The way I understand it, our SWIMP goes from 2009 to 2013. That's the 5-year time block. And at the end of our 5-year plan or program, these regional board, we revisit the plan, and there's potential revisions to BMPs. We have to, the BMPs actually, it's not that we have time, 5 years, to implement them. It's that they're staggered. There's some BMPs that we have to implement in year 1, some that we do in year 2, 3, and so on. So it's
That's to give everyone a chance to understand what they're doing and embrace it and actually do
partially,
it properly.
yeah. And at the end of the permit program, it will be revisited and revised. So basically, another plan will be implemented, and we'll start with year 1.
Thanks.
Is that about right? You want to add to that, Cameron?
Mr. Chair, the only thing I would add to that is that it's a 5-year permit, so before the end of that 5 years is up, we need to reapply, and we're submitting our proposal for the next 5-year permit. However, during the 5 years, the Regional Water Board has the authority to amend the permit at any time. So we had one amendment just in February of this year, just prior to submitting our annual report. Sometimes there are amendments that come after the Water Board's reviewed your report submittal. They see something that is working well and they want more of it. They see something that has been completed earlier than it was supposed to under the permit, and so they might have you do that each year of the permit instead of just in one of the years. So as Ms. Malanka said, there are things that the permit calls for in each of the 5 years, and there are things that the permit calls for throughout the 5 years, if that makes sense.
That's it.
Thank you again for your presentation. It was very informative, and it's very exciting to see so much good stuff happening so quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That brings us to item 7B, Water Quality Monitoring and Research Program Update and Fiscal Year 2011 Research Plan. And that sounds like the turf for Dr. Jill Murray. And keep in mind, as you hear her report, that we're going to be looking for a recommendation to implement the proposed 2011 research plan. So, Jill?
Thank you, Chair Moldiver. Good evening. Let me get situated here. Okay, I'm going to start with just a short background and goals segment on the water quality monitoring program. And I see we have 2 new members. Everyone else has been through this a few times, so I encourage you to look at the research plan, because that has it has a section for each of our elements with the research questions. And please contact me if you have any questions that I don't answer in this presentation. And then I'm going to go through some very brief results from our FY10 effort thus far. And there's more details about all those results in the staff report, and then another level of detail in the quarterly report, which is online at sbcreeks.com. And I'll finish with a short discussion about the FY11 research plan. So the goals of our program are, the goals of our program are to quantify how much microbial contamination and chemical pollution that we have in our creeks and watersheds and getting out to the beaches, evaluate what the impacts of that pollution are, and those impacts depend on whether we're talking about recreational users or aquatic organisms in the creeks or the ocean ecosystem. A very important goal is to evaluate the effectiveness of our projects and that includes collecting baseline data for future projects. We're identifying sources of pollution and evaluating long-term trends. Our efforts are broken up into quite a few elements, and those guide the questions around each of these elements guide our choice of locations and which chemicals and microbes we test for. In fiscal year 09, changes from fiscal year 09 to the year we're completing right now were pretty big, and we expanded our goals. We added the element of beach water quality. We had focused on that implicitly for years, but we made an explicit section with questions addressing that element, and we expanded the source tracking element. We also added some specific concerns that were new to the research plan, which are eutrophication and low dissolved oxygen, fire effects, and a question about the potential impacts of street slurry sealing. This is a map that shows the major watersheds in the city of Santa Barbara and our sampling locations. We range, some sites we sample biweekly, some quarterly, some only during storms. And the map that you have in the attachment also includes all of our projects, and so you can kind of see how our sampling sites relate to the projects that we have. So I'm going to move on to some brief results from our sediment testing. Our sediment testing was begun 3 years ago, so we finished 3 years of it, and it was initiated at the request of the Creeks Advisory Committee and the Watershed Subcommittee at the time. And they really encouraged us to look at the concentrations of chemicals in sediment, because that can be a kind of an integrator of things that happen upstream over long periods of time, because chemicals that are dissolved in the water column or attached to suspended sediments can then become absorbed to sediments and stick around for a longer period of time than dissolved compounds that might be flushing out with each storm. So for the past 3 years, we've collected sediment samples from the upper 5 centimeters of sediment at our estuary sites, or with Laguna Channel, just in the lowest part of the creek channel. And the year we started doing this was the same year that the state of California started developing sediment quality objectives for the first time. And we just hoped that their plan would kind of stick with the same sampling methods and same compounds to test for. And so luckily that was just finalized last year. And we test for metals, pesticides, herbicides, pHs, PCBs, and toxicity. And we can look at the results for each pollutant and compare that to kind of known criteria that might be expected to predict toxicity for organisms. But we also go through an algorithm that's in that sediment quality objective report and guidance manual from the state that puts together the effects of all of the compounds to get the cumulative effect of having multiple pollutants in one sample. And I conducted a very conservative analysis going through their method by using for each site the highest concentration of each pollutant that we had observed over the 3 years. And the results are broken into two sections. The first is identifying which are the actual constituents of concern. And for most of the sites and most of the chemicals, the compounds, the pollutants were below criteria that would cause concern. But the exceptions were low molecular weight. PAHs are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're organic compounds that can be highly toxic. They're related to combustion. They come from road runoff. They come from soil that was in the burned areas. There's different sources. We also have, especially at Laguna Channel, levels of legacy pesticides. These are chlorinated pesticides that have been banned for many years, including chlordane and the DDTs. And they're definitely found most at Laguna Channel compared to our other areas. And I think that's partly because Laguna Channel doesn't get a lot of runoff and sediment from the hills. It also doesn't flush out as well as the other creeks because of the tide gates and the water being pumped around the tide gates. Cadmium is a concern, and this was the biggest red flag was in the last year we found bifenthrin, which is a pyrethroid, which is a newly emerging class of pesticides that are being brought in as others are phased out. Found those at every site except for Sycamore Creek, and that before we'd only found them at one site. And then when we put the results for all of the compounds together for each site, that all sites score very well. all the estuarine sites have minimal potential for a chemically mediated effect on the sediment community, and our freshwater sites, which we use a different algorithm, are unlikely to cause toxicity. We also conducted toxicity tests, and we had acute tests the first 2 years and chronic tests the third year, and we never had any kind of toxic response in those sediments. We did a lot of storm monitoring this year. We did a simulated rainfall event, which I'll talk about when I get to the slurry sealing section. And we sampled 4 storms. We tested for the first flush, which is our first storm of the year, which usually has the highest concentrations of the compounds of concern. We collected baseline data for the parking lot infiltration project, tested for effects of the in a very limited means for effects of the Jesucita fire, and tested for slurry seal runoff effects. And then we did one long storm, which I'll talk about, looking at sources and routes of pollutants to Mission Creek. And we did a 4th storm looking at storm drain toxicity. So for our first flush sampling, we had non-detectable or low levels of most pollutants. And the exception for that storm was the surfactants, which are in soaps and detergents, and several pyrethroid pesticides were above the criteria for protecting aquatic health. We have not tested for pyrethroids in stormwater before. Usually people test for them only in sediment because they really do glom onto sediments and tend to, I think the popular thinking was that you really wouldn't find them in stormwater runoff. And there have been a couple of publications in the last 2 years highlighting that they are found at times in stormwater runoff, and I think this is because people are using more and more of them. And we started to educate the public about the pyrethroids in our last 2 e-newses ago. I don't know if you saw it, but we had a blurb about that, and we'll continue working on it. And maybe at the discussion time, Daniel or Mr. Wilson, if you could talk about your knowledge of this subject, it would be great. Okay, then I mentioned we did a large storm, and the storm wasn't that large, but we sampled for many hours throughout it. This was great because it was a perfect storm for doing this kind of testing. It came at 5 p.m. It was in one very clear blob marching down the radar instead of our usual hard-to-track storms. It started about 5 p.m., ended about 3 in the morning, and it was just very discreet and well contained. And it was about an inch of rain in the total storm. And I'm going to show you some graphs, but the overall summary is that we found high levels of surfactants and indicator bacteria early in the storm, and those tapered off, and then the turbidity and sediment spiked later in the storm. And so we're first seeing the street runoff, and then we're seeing the runoff from the hills come down. And so here's what the rainfall pattern and flow in Mission Creek looked like. Do we have a... Okay. So the green is the rainfall, and the axis is on the right, so you can see we had almost an inch over several hours, and a very steady, this is the cumulative rainfall, so it's just a very steady increase. And this is the flow in Mission Creek at Los Olivos. I think that the gauge is not that sensitive at the low end, so this should be a little more shallow of an increase, but you really don't see much in the channel until all of a sudden it just hits some critical level in the upper watershed and pushes the flow down. On the upper row, it's not a great photo, but this shows what the actual creek water looked like. So this was 10 minutes before it started raining. This was 5 minutes after it started raining, and we kind of draw a line to these different samples. This really dark water didn't happen until later in the storm when we, right about here, we had a lot more. Basically after you had that increase in runoff was when the really dark water came. So in the bottom panel we have surfactants in red, and I'll just let you know that about, I think the criteria that we have in our basin plan is 0.2. So above here is when you start to see some concerns for aquatic organisms. So that concentration really increased in the water, and it came down. Now, it came down, that doesn't mean there isn't any surfactant there, because it might just be really diluted. But it's not there at concentrations that are considered harmful. And then copper definitely came off our watershed early in the storm, but then really peaked So some of that is definitely natural copper coming off of our upper watershed sediment. It correlates very well with our sediment concentrations, which I'm not showing you. Okay, so moving on to beach water quality, I included a slide showing what our research questions are for this element since it is new. We added this this fiscal year. How do creeks and storm drains relate to beach water quality and beach warnings? And the beach warnings are based on indicator bacteria. The county collects the samples every week, and if the indicator bacteria are above certain thresholds, they post the beaches with a warning. We've talked many times about the limitations and caveats with indicator bacteria, but that's what dictates beach warnings now, and it may continue to do so well into the future. So we also continue to ask what causes these beach warnings and where do these indicator bacteria come from. This spring, we conducted a statistical analysis of 15 years of beach indicator bacteria data. This was data that was collected mostly by Santa Barbara County, also Santa Barbara Channel Keeper, a little bit with the city. And it's data from Arroyo Burro Beach, Ledbetter, East Beach at Mission Creek, and East Beach at Sycamore Creek. And we compared it with rainfall data, lagoon, whether lagoons were open or closed, ocean temperature, tides, and some other factors. And this analysis was conducted by Stephanie Dolmack-Connell, who is a brand master student, water quality intern. She's just done a superb job. She also, fortunately, was taking a statistics class at the same time, and so was able to get consultation from Dr. Bruce Kendall at the Bren School. I really appreciate that as well. This is a very small subset of her results, and this is thinking about all of the beach data combined. Everything that she's done has also been separated by beach, so we can learn how different beaches respond differently. But we all know that bacteria levels are higher during wet weather. Their beaches are 3 to 6 times more likely to exceed or post a warning when rain has fallen in the previous 72 hours. But during dry weather, and this includes winter dry weather, the warning frequency is much lower when the lagoons are closed. And we know that a lot of the indicator bacteria come from the creeks, but it still gets out to the ocean, and these berms are just acting as a very effective sand filter. So combining the data from all the beaches, total coliform, exceedance beach warnings based on total coliform numbers, we have about 10% of the days a warning is posted when it's dry weather and the lagoon is open. When the lagoon is closed, that drops to 0% likelihood of an exceedance based on total coliform bacteria. For Enterococcus, there's about a 9% exceedance rate when the lagoon is open during dry weather, drops to 1% when the lagoons are closed. And fecal coliform E. coli, 16% warning rate when they're open, the lagoons are open, and down to 5% when closed. This was a really interesting finding for us. I look at the data every quarter and I plot it out in a time series, but I'd never seen it condensed in this way. So moving on to street slurry sealing, we started to address this issue of all of our roadways are resurfaced every few years, and we started reading about some published literature on parking lot seal coats, that they can produce high levels of PAHs during runoff periods. And especially so if the parking lot seal coat is coal-based instead of asphalt-based. We have asphalt-based, so things are not as bad here as they are in other parts of the country. But we wanted to ask, could this be happening from the road surfaces as well? In addition, there's been kind of an anecdotal hypothesis that we have that there's a lot of foam generated from the runoff over these newly sealed streets. And we wanted to ask those questions in a more substantial way. So we started by simulating a rainfall event, and we had one control. I would really consider this a pilot test scale because we just had one control site and one test site. And the control site was right outside our office. The recently sealed site was in Hidden Valley. It was last October. It was within a month of the street being newly sealed. And we found we tested for metals, pHs, toxicity, and we did some measurements of how much foam there was in a beaker, and then shook it up for a while, and then how long that foam lasted, and we tracked that. So it was very clear that in the slurry sealed site there was more foam, and it was much longer lasting foam. And there's a rule of thumb in illicit discharge detection that natural-based foams from proteins in the water generally dissipate pretty quickly, whereas synthetic foams from surfactants and soaps are longer lasting. The toxicity was higher in the runoff from our sealed site, and we also swept up sediment from each of those areas and had that tested, and the sediment had 10 times, the sediment from the slurry sealed site had 10 times the pHs. So it definitely incites us to want to study the topic more. We did do some limited storm monitoring, which was less definitive. It wasn't, we didn't have control versus treated, and it warrants further testing. So we're going to do that this summer, and in collaboration with Dr. Arturo Keller from UCSB, and he is going to be working with Stephanie Dolmat-Connell. So we like her so much, we're keeping her on. Here's some pictures of that. So this is the fresh black site, our runoff, and then we stick a beaker right down in the opening of that catch basin and collect the runoff. When we poured those beakers into our bucket, this is what happened instantly. This is a runoff site outside our office. It was dirty. It had still had fire. It had ash. And here's it's hard to see, but there's the water being poured. It's definitely black water, but it's not creating that same kind of foam. And in the quarterly report, you can see a time series comparison of those beakers. I just wanted to give a status update on our source tracking projects. I won't present results. We'll do that in January when we come back, but we have our ongoing grant with Dr. Holden to build a source tracking toolbox, protocol development. That's going really well. The funding is back on. We're kind of condensing almost 2 years of work into 1 year of work, so we're going gangbusters on that. And then we threw in there a second project, the sewage sniffing dog. We had a community forum on it last Wednesday, and we had a workshop, a more professional level workshop yesterday. They were just here for a week and a half. This is another grant-funded project from the Water Environment Research Foundation, and we're working with the company Environmental Canine Services. It's the only company in the world, the only dogs in the world that have been trained to do this, and also UCSB again. And we just had a week and a half. So much fun. It was a great tool. We're going to really try to bring forward this tool to other communities as we produce the final report for the grant. This is Logan on the left, who sits when he smells sewage. He's been trained to detect sewage and soaps. And this is Sable, who barks. And then we also, as I said, we worked with UCSB, so where the dogs gave us a positive, we collected samples that will be tested for the DNA techniques, and we'll be able to correlate the two, although I'm not sure which technique is better necessarily. And we just were able to, the great thing about this tool is it was real-time results, which we've never had before, and we could just canvas so much area in such a short time, and we had some major success. So we don't really have any major recommendations for the coming year. We just need to keep plugging away. We've got some questions that we didn't even get to in the past year, like eutrophication and low-dissolved oxygen. Well, I would like to stop our sediment testing at the outfall sites for the broad suite of compounds. I think we've answered that question for now, and really focus on the pyrethroids and move upstream into some different sites in every creek, and conduct some additional pyrethroid testing in storm runoff and other emergent pesticides. We tested for a new one called fipronil. We didn't find it, but we'll keep our eyes on the list of what's emerging and what we should test for. And we're just finishing the fiscal year, so as we review results, the actual sampling table will change, but we'll spend the same amount of laboratory money for our outsourced samples. And our next steps are to carry out the research plan, continue to produce our quarterly and annual reports, and as I mentioned, come back in January for our annual report and talk more about the source tracking work. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jill. This is a great report, and I was very pleased to see that Stephanie from Brent is doing so well, because I remember I talked to her last summer when she first came here, and she was looking for places where she could get constructively involved, and I remember I recommended that she call up you guys, so it's great to see she's prospering.
Oh, I did not know about that connection. Thank you, Chair Moldiver.
I'm a fan of her work, very enthusiastic. Are there any questions for Dr. Murray? I know Daniel, there were one or two topics you wanted to raise. Paul?
Thank you for your presentation. So, in the areas where you found the sediment with high levels of DDT, would that be an action that you would want to remove those sediments, or is it best just to leave them undisturbed?
That's a good question, and I haven't compared the results to thresholds that are recommended for dredging, and by removing some, we might stir up even higher concentrations down below. So we have not tackled that as a question. It's a good one.
So the information gathered is just purely just information.
Purely
No
information.
action.
I would say if our toxicity results were coming back worse, we probably would have talked more about action at this point. But so far, the toxicity levels look okay. So those compounds can be in the sediment, but not being released. They're tightly absorbed. You know, they've been there for a long time, and they're not being released as the sediments are definitely stirred up as the toxicity test is conducted.
Okay, thanks.
May I? Thank you. I'd like to just sort of unequivocally say that this program is first rate. It's I think it's a tremendous asset and benefit to this entire community, and I think this is just really good use of Measure B funds. It's in conjunction with the other programs that Creeks Division is doing. This is incredible use of funds for getting some incredibly detailed information for specific surgical action planning, which so just huge compliment. And I mean, just without a doubt, I'm definitely going to recommend not making any changes above and beyond. You're in total control here as far as you know what you're doing and have full faith in your program. So I just kind of want to put that out right off the bat.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson.
I do have just a couple very minor questions just for my own sort
That's
of
good.
understanding of how some of these are moving forward to maybe try to help maybe some minor massaging, not even that. So I guess pyrethroids. I appreciate emails going out. I would probably consider myself a little bit more informed and knowledgeable on biochemistry than probably the average person in the city of Santa Barbara. And with all due respect to emails and all, I would guess that I probably did get that email, and I'm just going to be totally honest that I have no idea. So to the extent that partnerships could maybe be made with like Santa Barbara Home Improvement Center, I would probably guess that a very large proportion of the amount of pyrethroids that are found in our water are probably sold from a couple key retail shops in town, and I'm not suggesting how to make those partnerships because I can't imagine they'd be easy, but to the any extent that any sort of information sharing and support collaboration amongst the retailers and the Creeks Division and actually educating and even more importantly possibly finding less chemical intensive and toxic alternatives such as boric acid and sugar and water for the the ants and the termites and so on and so forth. So I just kind of put that out there.
That's a good suggestion. And I know we have worked with Home Improvement and or OSH in the past on some pesticide information. It's in, as you mentioned, the termites. It's a very popular termiticide, and especially for subterranean termites. There aren't very many alternatives for subterranean termites except for doing structural modifications, so just moving the soil out away from the house. It's also in, not bifenthrin, but some of the others in flea and tick collars. So it's not just garden pesticides. It's coming up everywhere.
What about time of year application? Possibly, fate and transport of the pyrethroids. If maybe the best time to treat termites was in summer, subterranean termites, and maybe the winter time it's not so good anyway. So perhaps, I don't know. You see where I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, or build BMPs into, if you're going to spray along a house, build in a BMP so that runoff doesn't, you don't want the compound to leave anyway if you're.
And I would give the
Putting it
benefit
into
of the
protect.
doubt to a lot of the applicators and users in the residential realm that if they were armed with the information, they would probably more judiciously or responsibly use it. So, again, a little tear-off piece of thing on a little something next to the bottle on the shop. I don't know. I don't want to take any more of this
No, that's
meeting
an
time
excellent
to talk
idea.
about
And
that.
Liz and I will be, and Cameron, working on strategies.
I wanted to ask you about surfactants. We definitely, probably about 7 years ago here, if our memory still is with me, we talked a lot about degradation byproducts from glyphosate and Roundup. And as I understand, the surfactants are actually probably the most toxic element of glyphosate, at least in the aquatic environment, if I still remember correctly from those conversations.
I remember
And
you talking about that.
I'm wondering, the surfactants, any discernment of where these surfactants are coming from so we could maybe figure out what their source is and then again sort of approach the the use and application of them such that we can encourage them to be entering the creeks a lot less.
Yeah, we'll be continuing that line of research. So during that big storm, we just measured it in the creek and in a couple of drain in a gutter. Even late in the storm, in the gutter is at high concentration. The technique is very general. It's just methodological. It's called MBAS, and that stands for methyl blue activated substances. So it's any anionic surfactants will react with it. It doesn't test for cationic surfactants, and this is kind of on a tangent of the slurry sealing. From our research, it looks like most of the surfactants that would cause foam in the slurry seals around here would be cationic, and so we wouldn't even catch them with that test. So we're looking into other testing methods, but haven't come up with anything yet. I think you can test directly for PNOE, which is the glyphosate byproduct.
I would like to make a specific recommendation that a small amount of sampling budget gets specifically put towards the subject of surfactants, cationic versus anionic, glyphosate versus slurry seal. I mean, these have real life implications as to how we as a community are, on a municipal level as well as an individual homeowner responsible level, are, living within our environment.
I'll definitely do that.
And just a couple other minor questions. Background copper, you'd let you catch up here. Certainly know that copper is acutely toxic in the aquatic environment, and you had made a comment that the levels seem to be normal with the background copper, and levels found in the I just wondering if you could
I'll go back to
share a
that
little
graph.
bit more information because I'm a little confused on that.
Okay, we have been concerned about copper for a while, and dissolved copper was the only metal that we ever had that consistently exceeded criteria for aquatic health. And so we, right around the same time, the EPA put forward new criteria, which take into account, you have to measure about 8 other factors. Dissolved organic carbon, water hardness, sulfate concentrations, chloride concentrations, all those things can either increase or decrease the dissolved copper toxicity. And so you develop a site-specific criteria or even a moment-specific criteria. When we've done that, we have no exceedances. Well, we've had a couple of exceedances, but in general, we don't have a copper toxicity problem by that measure. We've also conducted toxicity tests when we have high levels of dissolved copper. Those are not creating toxicity in the organisms that we've tested for. So we have kind of put that aside as a major research concern. There are researchers studying how very low levels of dissolved copper can harm juvenile salmonids. And when I've gone back and looked at our levels, even without calculating all the other factors, they're below those levels of concern in dry weather. Probably during storms, it's not necessarily the case. So I haven't totally closed the book on that. And what I meant here was not that these not that these concentrations. So on this graph, this is total copper, not dissolved copper. And what I meant was based on our analysis of sediment concentrations and turbidity concentrations and the timing of the other compounds that are coming off of roadways, that this copper is likely coming in with the sediment that's coming from the upper watersheds.
Okay.
So I guess natural erosive source would have been a better term than background.
Okay. Thank you. And was the copper found more in the Haley Drain or the Laguna Channel than, say, Mission or Sycamore?
Oh, I cannot recite those levels off the top
Okay.
of my head, but I can definitely get those
That's
to you.
fine. In the attachment to what we got, the FY11 research plan, on the second page where you talk about source tracking and illicit discharge, right in the middle of the page, the specific areas of concern, Barger Canyon, Las Positas Creek, and Haley Drain. When I looked at that, I'm wondering if Barger Canyon is maybe high in nutrients, Las Positas Creek is maybe high in pesticides and or nutrients, and Haley Drain is maybe more PAHs and metals and that kind of sort of distribution of problem areas. I'm wondering if correlations are starting to tease themselves out.
Well,
there.
Haley Drain has been a concern for indicator bacteria and then the DNA markers for human waste, so that's why we put the diversion in there and why we've continued to research that with Dr. Holden. Las Positas Creek has a lot of nutrients, and I think I would like to get back to you before I quote different levels,
Okay.
but Barger Canyon has been high for many compounds.
So as we, obviously, I'm sure, worth a follow-up offline conversation, but certainly as we start sort of figuring out which areas have, more of the problematic areas, it obviously helps fine-tune the action plan and communications with those areas.
Yeah, and in this case, it was more like really trying to go and look for specific, almost point sources, if you will, of getting into the creek.
So I actually have three more questions. So I just kind of put it out there. If can I keep rolling here? A couple more. We doing okay for time? Respect for everybody. Creek walks and cleanups. Question there, is the amount of trash in the creeks decreasing over time from when the initial inventory that I guess I conducted in '99 versus 2005 when Mr. Burgess, and compared to now 2010, we've got a good decade of information. How the screens are going in now, which is great, but prior to that, the 10 years, how has creek trash generally changed in composition and or in volume, compared to when we started? Obviously, how is outreach and education working? Every couple of years we sort of hear something about this. I just figured this is a good opportunity to just get a refresher.
I think rather than give you a detailed response, I'll definitely put it on. Well, it's in our quarterly report, so you are welcome to look that up. We can have a phone call or meeting about it. I'll definitely put it on the end of year
How about just
report.
a
But I can tell you,
30-second
Okay,
back
so-
of envelope anecdotal? Wave your arms. How we doing?
we've limited our sampling to our quantitative sampling to Old Mission Creek and Lower Mission Creek, and we didn't collect samples for several years. So we had that gap in there from when you did it to Mr. Burgess. It looks like trash has gone down, but sometimes that's due to scouring. And I think it's the next couple of years will show us whether the screens really have an impact.
There are also a lot of variables. One of them is scouring when the sampling is taking place, how recently it's rained, those kinds of things. But also over the years, we've increased our effort on trash removal. So we have the screens going in now. That's a trash prevention effort. But over the last 3 years, each year we've increased our trash removal effort. And so we've actually seen the way we measure that is by weight. We've actually seen those weights increasing each year for the last 3 years that we have data for, because we spend more time taking it out.
Thanks. So just a couple other I just wanted to put in a positive comment that I thought the whole sort of beach sampling indicator bacteria and techniques, the whole program that you guys are working on there and having the intern help out, I just thought that was just right on point and really really smart. Regarding the berms being opened and closed in the estuaries and looking at the correlations of, an order of magnitude or so more likely to have a warning or not, depending on the various factors. When the berm is closed, there was still, I suppose, could you bring the slide back up that talked about that? And there it is. Great. I guess it's more sort of, the question is easier to ask speaking about fecal coliform, just because the numbers are a little more tangible. When the berm's closed, to what extent do you think the fecal coliform levels are coming from pets, dogs, and the like? And is there any, has there been any sort of discussion heading down that street to kind of try to start teasing that out? Or are we there yet, or do we still need more?
I think
info?
a lot will be teased out in Stephanie's report, which she's putting together right now.
So it's coming.
It's coming. I mean, it's not going to be totally answered. And a beach warning, just because there's a beach warning for one class of indicator bacteria but not another, there's still probably some of both classes present. It's just the cutoff might be at a different relative level for one class versus the other. I went back and looked at the data for which we have samples from the like the integrator site, the downstream creek site, compared to the estuary mouth, which we don't do weekly or regularly anymore. But we do at Arroyo Burro, and except for Enterococcus was different, and I don't want to quote myself because I don't want to get it wrong here. But most of them, about half the time, the levels seem to increase, and half the time levels seem to decrease between the creek and the estuary mouth. That's part of the information that you're looking at. And you can get other information by looking at Ledbetter, which doesn't have a creek most of the time. And it has pretty strong tide effects. So the falling tide is leading to increased warnings. And that's either pulling out groundwater that has, or beach pore water that has high levels of indicator bacteria,
Kelp.
or washing decaying kelp off the beach.
And the USGS did some investigation on that, as I recall.
Mm-hmm. They did some work suggested some of the kelp was incubating bacteria.
And testing, say, looking at Arroyo Burro, for example, just on the ocean side of the berm, just on the sort of the bridge side, the creek side of the lagoon, and testing in the lagoon at the same time, is that still still happening?
Yes.
And I would imagine that the lagoon is amplifying everything.
Well, like I said, about half the time it is, and half the time it isn't. And sometimes that's because the lagoon is impounded by by ocean water also. So it's complicated.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And then, so the last thing is, if you could just sort of refresh my memory or educate me, which I think would probably help others as well, about the toxicity. How you actually measure toxicity.
We outsource all of our toxicity tests to a lab in Ventura, and they take, for example, our stormwater and distribute it into, we give them a gallon of stormwater, they distribute it into 5 replicates. Then they have, usually, they have several different test organisms, and so we decide what we want them to run. Typically for our stormwater, we do fathead minnows, and so they're juvenile fathead minnows, and they'll put several in each batch and see how many die over 5 days. So we get a number of % survival. And the water, our Central Coast Water Board considers a sample toxic if it has less than 80% survival. We've had, let's see, I think we've had probably close to 30 samples in all of our creeks, dry weather, wet weather. We've had always above 90% survival scaled to the control, usually 95%, except for one early storm Laguna Channel sample had really low survival, and a couple of storm drain samples had really low survival. One was from, I think, Haley, one was from Hope. And then this year, late in the season, we sampled 4 drains, or 3 gutters and 1 drain, and had 100% survival. And other test organisms have longer lengths of time for the test. So a chronic toxicity test, which might pick up the effects of different compounds, might be a 10-day test with a different organism. Some people recommend testing a vertebrate, an invertebrate, and an algae species. We haven't done that yet.
So your knowledge is a huge asset to the Creeks Division. It's really great to have you on board, and with the direction that you have going, this is a great program, and we're really lucky. And for the benefit of my colleagues on the committee here, I just can't emphasize enough how important having a really good sampling program to actually get specific information so that money can be wisely spent in the future. It's really good use of public funds here. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. And I was...
And I'd make a motion anytime.
well, I'll just take this opportunity to thank the committee and the community for supporting Measure B and providing these kind of funds. We're a step ahead of the regulatory requirements on monitoring. Phase 2 communities are not required to monitor for specific things yet, but communities that haven't put together a program are oftentimes required to create a monitoring plan prescribed ahead of time, and it doesn't address specific questions. And so the flexibility that the Creeks Division has provided has allowed us to directly answer the questions we're interested in and conduct the kind of pilot studies that allow us to get grant funding for larger research projects. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I want to see if Ms. Weber or Mr. Bullock have any last questions. Yeah, Paul.
Thanks. So, are you happy with the results? Do we have healthy creeks and good oceans? And do you have any comparisons to other cities in California our size?
That is a very large question to finish up on. And some of this we've addressed in other presentations, and I would really welcome the opportunity to kind of walk you through some of those older presentations. I feel very safe swimming at our beaches and love to let my kids swim at our beaches. If I were immune compromised, I would not swim right in front of our outfalls. And for anyone, I wouldn't walk through really warm lagoons with a deep open cut, because there are environmental bacteria that are not related to pollution, Vibrio and staph, that are always there, but especially at higher temperatures. And if you have an open wound, it's not very safe. Our creeks are in really good shape. I think maybe better shape than people anticipated. I think because of a lot of the efforts of some of the cleanup efforts, which have been very effective, but there has been some media that almost describes creeks as a cesspool or something. Our creeks are not cesspools. Our creeks provide habitat and potential habitat upon restoration for really high quality creeks. But we have problems, and we want to continue hammering on those problems and continue looking for what could be a problem. And sometimes it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. But when we go get our toxicity test results back and they're generally not toxic, that's a really good sign.
Well, I wanted to get one in first, if you don't mind. In terms of the bifenthrin and how to try to reduce its presence in future tests, it's good to do an educational appeal to the retailers and the professional suppliers. But in terms of our education community outreach, so we also work with the Green Gardener program and not only update them, but ask them to spread the message to their alumni list, which they keep in touch with, and that way, by word of mouth, independent contractors and people in the neighborhoods who want to choose the right product but don't always know what they are. And as Betsy knows, Eric Cardenas has been very, very successful with these kind of programs throughout the county. There are different ways of getting the word out, and obviously working with the stores is one way, but also working with the professionals who've demonstrated that they really care and letting them spread the word professionally through their colleagues is another way. So I take it from your nods, you're already doing that?
Some of this data is fairly hot off the press, so this really is just beginning. And the results are, in all communities, are just continuing to get higher because these really are new compounds, and I think the broad use of them has increased only recently.
And then, if I understand it correctly, as a subset of Daniel's motion to concur with the staff recommendation to implement the research plan for fiscal year 2011, he has one last question.
Not a question, but it was sort of in response to your last comment to our colleague over here regarding sort of looking for the needle in the haystack sometimes. I just wanted to comment that until we have steelhead swimming up our creek and spawning, we all have work to do. And so even though it may be an elusive target, sampling and contaminants and toxicity and sediment and so on and so forth, I think the real litmus for the Creeks Division and this community at large is, when we have steelhead spawning up our creeks and we can go fish them, then we've succeeded. And that, I think, should be the ultimate goal we're all heading towards. And with that, I would like to make the motion to concur with staff recommendation, implement the proposed research plan for fiscal year 2011.
Is there a second? Seconded by Ms. Weber. Are there any questions or suggestions or amendments to the motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Are there any abstentions? All right, let the record show that the motion is passed unanimously. And thanks again to Jill for a very enlightening and upbeat report. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, I guess, Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just before we move to item number 8 and adjourn, I just wanted to remind the committee that we have canceled our July 21st meeting, and we will reconvene on August 18th for our next meeting.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I think ratings-wise, this is probably one of the most heavily watched broadcasts in city TV and public access TV. And I want to make sure that during the summer rerun season, people realize that we won't be there next month. So I don't want too many lives, to be changed and impacted. Yeah, so we have one more motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second? All right, it's been moved by Mr. Wilson, seconded by Mr. Bullock, and we're adjourned at 7 p.m. Thank you very much, and best wishes to everyone for a good summer.